right, great day, Gadfly subscribers. It's Carlos. I hope everyone's having a great day and had a wonderful weekend. Today is Monday, March the 29th, and also want to welcome those that are tuning in to a Gadfly multi-channel network live stream for the very first time. Please visit our work over at the gadfly.vhx.tv. You can find out about our premium subscription-based system that includes a 30-day free trial, and then either you can do a $10 a month or $100 a year subscription based. Also, check out our social media platforms. We post quite a bit of content over there as we release public content, and that is over at the gadfly.mcn. And then we also have a Facebook page as well. Very excited today to be joined by London Paul of the Sears Report. I've been following Paul's work for several years, and not only just in terms of his articles, but his commentary on his premium content, his daily podcast, just, so much there. So Paul, great day. How are you, sir?
Yes, very well. How are you, CJ?
Doing great, Paul. We went back and forth several times over the weekend regarding messages and things were occurring, and there was a video that actually caught our eye that we thought that we would kind of dig through a little bit, and that's in regards to the economic multipolar world that's evolving, and that sounds complex, and it can be. So I thought what we could do is over a series of podcasts is really break that down to quite understand in America where capitalism went wrong, where we see a massive wealth extraction from the working poor, from the middle class to the top 1%, Paul, and that didn't happen overnight, Paul. So I think it's worth a discussion.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, it is a complicated subject, and if we just dived in and went, well, actually, there's two competing worlds. There's what I've called the old reality and the new reality. And if you just jump in the middle, it's kind of where's the context? Why did we get where we are today? And try to also kind of write some of the misunderstandings, the assumptions people have with regards to what's controlling the world, how the world operates. And a great example of this is this idea that still sort of permeates a lot of people's thoughts is that the UK controls the world and the US is some sort of puppet. And it absolutely is not the case. It's the other way around. And we can explain historically the massive significant changes that have occurred, well, where are we, in the last, kind of 103 or 4 years in the sort of back end of World War I. And also just to try and lay some understanding of why this happened. And I've always made this point, Europe's the key battleground for the United States in terms of, if it loses control of Europe, it's game over. I mean, because the multipolar world, of course, is expanding outwards from as part of Eurasia. You've got China, Russia, increasingly Iran. We see finally this signing of this 25-year deal as people in the West trying to suggest it's nothing when in fact it's quite the contrary. And the multipolar world's building out across the Middle East, into Africa, into the Eurasia, the Stan republics, and into Southeast Asia, and even in Central America and parts of South America, and it's building out. And really the old sort of reality, the old empire, which is really now largely the United Kingdom, well, the US, the United Kingdom, and Europe. Okay, there's the Five Eyes Alliance, so you can include Canada and Australia and New Zealand, but even they're sort of hovering between two worlds now. And the United Kingdom, of course, is now in its sort of post-Brexit days. It's kind of ironic that the UK goes, well, we've left the European Union, the controlling mechanism, and which is, I mean, Washington controls the European Union. That is irrefutable. And so Britain thinks we've left one controlling mechanism. Now it's trying to jump into bed with the US. It wants trade deals with the United States. It's kind of going from one facet of a vassal state relationship, and it thinks it's left the European Union and doesn't realize, in fact, it's still part of a vassal state relationship. But if we go back to sort of pre-World War One, and obviously everyone focuses on the fact that there was the creation of the Federal Reserve in 1913, and okay, lo and behold, we had World War II. And that the creation of the Federal Reserve and World War II are not really linked in that sense. I mean, what I think is important to note is if you look back historically, the United States sort of pre-World War One and had a very vibrant economy. It had this very solid working relationship between what we might term in modern terms the private and public sector, and it worked extremely well as the US had a vibrant economy. And those who sought to hijack the US economy suddenly were not particularly interested in the US having a vibrant economy. They had designs on wanting to subjugate the world. And effectively, what some people refer to as a kind of, it's like feudalism, where effectively they're the landlords and we all pay rent, meaning subsidies to monopolies, and they control everything, and we have to pay whatever the going rate is because they are a monopoly, and therefore sort of you might as well say kind of in a sort of post World War One era, from there onwards there was no intention of ever having a vibrant US economy anymore. It was irrelevant. It was all about controlling and subjugating the world. And if we look back to what Europe was pre-World War One, and obviously we had the big empires. You had the Ottoman Empire, which is kind of where Turkey stands, as Austro-Hungarian Empire, obviously Austria-Hungary. But obviously it also includes what you would now refer to as modern, well, it was modern day Czechoslovakia, which became the Czech Republic and Slovakia. And then, of course, it was being part of what was, of course, Yugoslavia, which ceased to exist. And obviously, it was part of what is now modern day Romania. And these were vast empires. Now, for the United States to conquer Europe and control Europe, it couldn't allow these vast empires to exist, because that was an impediment for them to control. They ultimately wanted to subjugate the United Kingdom and allow them to become the world's reserve currency and the world's dominant power, instead of Britain having its empire and the world reserve currency. And if you look at the sort of fallout of World War One as well, look at in Russia, you had the end of the Tsars. The Tsars were the richest dynasty. So there's another example. They disappeared. And when you look at geographically the map of Europe pre-World War One, and then you go to post-World War One, of course, there was no Ottoman Empire anymore. There was no Austro-Hungarian Empire. I mean, the whole map of Europe. I mean, okay, well, actually, what was Great Britain changed, because then you had the Irish Republic and Northern Ireland. But okay, Portugal didn't change, Spain didn't change, France, Belgium, the Netherlands. Obviously, Germany was rewritten. Yeah, Austria and Hungary existed, but then you had Czechoslovakia, then you had Yugoslavia, and then an extended Romania. Then you had the nation state of Poland. You had the Baltic republics, so you had Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. And in fact, also you still had what was called East Prussia, which then became obviously eventually part of modern day Poland. Russia was, or the USSR was kind of obviously smaller as a result of this. And then we had the sort of, when you look economically what happened between the wars, it was certainly engineered to have World War II. I mean, Germany was crippled by the Versailles Treaty. World War II happened. Of course, what a lot of people aren't aware of is just how much the elements within the United States financed and bankrolled Hitler into power. I mean, look at Germany was on its knees with the Weimar Republic, and suddenly within less than a decade, it had rebuilt its nation completely. It was economically strong, and it was able then to be financed to fight a world war effectively. And very few people seem to ask the question, how was this even possible? You know, well, obviously, the United States wanted to create effectively the Third Reich. Why? Because it wanted another world war. Why? Because it wanted then to economically collapse Europe, meaning Britain would be bankrupt, Germany would be bankrupt. There was no way that Hitler was ever going to allow to win World War II. And I mean, that's why at some point, of course, eventually the United States kind of left its state of neutrality and then intervened just to make sure that they didn't win the war. But even if Britain had, I mean, I'm speculating on this point, but if the United Kingdom had effectively lost the war to Germany, I think the United States would have intervened, because therefore you would have had this immense controlling empire effectively ruling Europe, which of course, the United States would never have permitted. So of course you get to the back end of World War II, but it's interesting during World War II because Congress approved in March, I think it was March 1941, it's called the Lend-Lease Act. So what it allowed is Roosevelt could have pretty much all authority where they could provide ammunition, tanks, aeroplanes, trucks, and food to Europe without, obviously not the Germans, the Allies. That didn't violate the United States position of neutrality. So the major consequences of that was that it allowed significant economic support, in inverted commas, meaning debt crippling support, and therefore it was obviously to ensure that the Axis powers with Germany were not going to win the war. Now, of course, in 1945, the Lend-Lease Act was amended. I mean, it was supposed to be temporary. Why was it still, once the United States joined the war? The Lend-Lease Act should have been dissolved, but it wasn't. And what's telling is in 1945, it was amended, which prohibited the president from allowing no post-war relief, post-war rehabilitation, or post-war construction. So effectively, at the end of World War II, Europe was crippled. Britain was bankrupt, and Britain had opportunities. It still sort of notionally had its Commonwealth, its empire. But by the end of the war, the UK basically took the soft option, which meant it was then in servitude, debt servitude to the United States, which allowed Bretton Woods to come into existence, which therefore meant the US dollar became the world reserve currency. What a surprise. And it usurped the pound as the world reserve currency. And the British Empire was effectively dead and buried. Okay, it didn't. I mean, gradually Britain lost the Commonwealth, like Pakistan, India. The UK never recovered. Okay, there was a kind of post-war, in inverted commas, economic resurgence in the 50s, 60s, but then since then it's been weak and irrelevant. Okay, and effectively the United Kingdom has become a vassal state of the United States. In terms of foreign policy, that's why you see this huge sort of link between the Five Eyes Alliance in a broader sense, but you have the very tight alliance between US intelligence and UK intelligence, and that's why we see them concocting all manner of stories that, for example, the whole Novichok story with regard to the Skripals and obviously Navalny, and that's just one example. If they want some sort of US foreign policy decision to be implemented globally, then they'll come up with some concocted story to justify why there's chemical weapons in Syria and therefore we have to go in and bomb Assad. Obviously, people talk a lot about the Rothschilds, and no doubt at some point they were very influential, but by the end of World War II, they were fading into obscurity. No one's disputing they have wealth. To what extent is debatable now. But they're not a big player on the world stage like people like to believe they are. And because it's simply the case that by the time we got to the end of World War II, Europe was at the behest of the United States economically, because the whole of Europe was effectively bankrupt. And of course, when we got to the end of World War II, people look and go, well, why was it that Russia effectively was an ally of the West in fighting World War II? Well, of course, at some point, Germany and Russia were allies. Then, of course, for some inexplicable reason, Hitler decided to invade Russia, and of course, then they became the enemy. But when World War II was over. I mean, apart from the fact that Germany was split into two, and then, of course, you had East and West Berlin, and there was sectors controlled by the West and sectors controlled by Russia. But that was a symbolic gesture too, because effectively the fear was if you had a united Germany, it might rise up again at some point in the future. But the dynamic shifted dramatically because effectively Stalin didn't trust the West, didn't trust the Americans, and therefore you started to then see in the post-war era the birth of the sort of Warsaw Pact, the Soviet bloc, and the interesting we talk about the likelihood of World War III happening and nuclear wars. Well, they effectively controlled Czechoslovakia, Poland, Hungary, Romania, what was Yugoslavia, Bulgaria. So they built a buffer zone to protect themselves from the West. And of course, the West did absolutely nothing about it. You would have logically thought, well, there would have been a subsequent war as a result of that. There wasn't. Of course, we had the North Atlantic Treaty, NATO created in 1949. That was the United States, Canada. There was, I think, 11 European nations. And the idea was we're going to provide this collective security against the Soviet Union. No wonder Russia panicked and thought, hang on a minute, they may be invading us at some point or trying to invade us in the future. So the rest is history in terms of creating this buffer zone. And obviously, after the destruction of World War II, as we said, Europe was bankrupt. They couldn't rebuild their economies. They were terrified and were easily convinced of all manner of threats. And therefore, obviously, subsequently, what happened is we had the birth of NATO. And of course, then it was the convenient excuse for the United States to say, well, we need to be in Europe. We need to protect you. We need to protect you from the enemy of what was the Soviet Union. And therefore we need, and it gave them an excuse to be able to control a Europe. And ultimately, of course, we can go into later stages of history because you can't make these fundamental changes overnight. I mean, if you look at the map of Europe, sort of, let's say in 1917 or 16, okay, during the war, and you look at the map by the end of World War II, and in 30 years, Europe would be completely part of Europe, obviously not France, Spain, Portugal, as we said, and Italy, and of course Switzerland, whatever, but kind of as you move east, including obviously Germany, Poland, Czechoslovakia, so they'd be completely redrawn the map. The old empires had gone, and the US was then in a position to make significant inroads into Europe. And where we are today is Europe is a total vassal state of the United States. The European Union is controlled by the United States. Why? Because effectively, the major movers and shakers in Europe, and we're not talking about the people who are politicians or prime ministers in countries, they're just there to do as they're told, but the real movers and shakers, whoever those people are, and again, we have to be extremely careful of just naming names and pointing fingers, because ultimately the big players probably aren't even people anybody's aware of, but they are in the back pockets of the United States. They're bribed, completely in control. So when the United States wants foreign policy decisions made with respect to Europe, then those decisions are made. And the modern day European Union is a complete controlling mechanism. Who controls it? Brussels. European nations have less and less autonomy. They are not able to make their own decisions, be it economically, financially, politically. I mean, yes, you can vote different political parties in, but as soon as you get something that you might regard to be potentially a bit of a renegade who may actually start to break the European Union up. I mean, Italy is a great example of that, of where politically there might have been opportunities where Italy may have started to look to leave. Well, those political systems are squashed. Who's squashing it? Ultimately, the United States. The biggest fear in the European Union is Brussels. The biggest fear of a breakup of the European Union is the United States. They don't want, because then nations become autonomous again. This is why who's actually really afraid of China making encroachment into Europe, say into Greece or Italy or Nord Stream 2? Who's the one who makes all the noises about it? It's the United States. Why? Because they don't want the new reality and the new political ideology and economic ideology that's coming in. That's basically the way the West used to be run in prior to World War One, which is actually real capitalism, not the fake sort of feudalism or neo-capitalism, whatever, which isn't capitalism at all. So it's the United States who doesn't want Chinese investment into Europe. Why? Because Europe then starts to become independent. Europe can start to go back to classical models of capitalism, which actually benefits the country, benefits the people. Whereas look at what happens in Europe. And this is a great example. Let's take Greece as an example in the modern era. We're sort of having to go into the modern era a bit to explain. And then obviously we'll go into more detail with regards to Europe through various phases and what's happened in terms of economic policy and obviously and geopolitical policy. But just look at Greece. When Greece obviously should never have joined the European Union. There's another example. Let's just drag nations in. The southern nations shouldn't be in the European Union. But what happens? Greece defaults. What's the thing? It's not about having a productive economy that says, okay, how can we make Greece economically strong again? What do we do? How do we actually make those loans work productively to stimulate economic growth so that Greece can then repay its debt via economic strength? No. What's the first thing? Austerity. Let's cripple the economy even more. Why? Because then we can take the public ownership of industry and privatize it, and then we can control it. And therefore it becomes like this idea of the landlord and the rent. So then everything starts to be subsidized. You have to pay subsidies and rent effectively to monopolies, to the private sector. Note how the West all thought that privatizing things was this great economic miracle. It was freeing up market economy. It wasn't. What it did is it took control of nations away from governments, and it gave the control completely to monopolies, who then subjugated nations. And all they did with Greece is they just asset stripped it. And that's the whole economic model. Look at the IMF, look at the World Bank. It's all about basically subjugating nations, putting them into austerity, crippling them, and then effectively seizing all their assets. Whereas the Chinese model, which they try to tell you is, it's debt. They're putting you in debt. They're subordinating you. They don't do that. It's exactly the opposite. It's trying to emancipate nations and say you have economic freedom again. Your government will get to make the choices. That's why when China rolls up into Greece and says, okay, here's the port of Piraeus. Okay, it's not privately owned, but we can have a partnership, which means it stays in state control. You can make profits, we can make profit. The Americans then have an aneurysm because they're going, hang on, you're changing the world structure. This isn't how it's supposed to be. We want to control everything. We want to subjugate things. So people call it the 1%. I call them spheres of influence. They want to control everything, not just militarily, economically, financially. So that's why there's this enormous pushback, because effectively, the irony is, what China and Russia are proposing in the multipolar world is to take the world back 120, 130 years and say, this is the future. We're going back the way it used to be. We're not going to have this situation where, take Europe as an example, where it's just basically being gutted to the point that, there's no economic prosperity anymore. It's more and more just trying to seize control. I mean, not encouraging entrepreneurialism, not controlling true economic growth, not and putting everything into the hands of private corporations, which you're told is free market economics, and it absolutely isn't. It's in fact it's the complete reverse. So we kind of reach a point. Okay, we've kind of digressed, but it's worth kind of pointing out, and we'll talk about the old reality and the new reality, and how there's this clash of almost civilizations. One that's wants to restore nations to have sovereignty, to have control of government, to have control of their finances, control of their monetary policy, to remove the influence and control of central banks. Well, okay, yeah, central banks are controlled by governments, but here's the question: we know the United States. Look at it in modern day. The political system's a farce. It's not run for the benefit of the people. The political system, Congress, the Senate, well, the Senate and the House, the Congress. How many of those people are bought and paid for? Rather like the controllers in Europe. They're completely subjugated. They're there to do what they're told when they're told. They get rewarded richly. And the political system in the United States doesn't serve any function to benefit the American people. It's there to do the bidding of those who control the government, those who have the purse strings of the Treasury. And the Treasury controls the Fed and controls the banks, because the banks are just conduits to allow big monopolies to try to control everything. Now, people say, well, actually, you're trying to infer that this has been successful. Well, from their perspective, it was successful, but the whole thing blew up in 2008, and at some point we'll come to why it all blew up, and why ever since then people think, oh, they're wrestling control of everything. They're not wrestling control of anything. Basically, they're just now they know full well the game's up. They're just doing everything they can to try and, they think, wrestle control, or just wrestle control of the purse strings, make as much money and try to disappear with ill-gotten gains. But of course, ultimately, they're just debasing and destroying the very currency with which they tried to control the entire world, which was, of course, the dollar. But obviously, if you look in historic, well, maybe actually, let me just stop there, CJ, because it'd be good to get your input, anything you want to discuss or comment on, because I've obviously spoken for probably 25 minutes. So let's have a break from that.
Well, I think it's important, Paul, in terms of looking at the history, in terms of the World War I, World War II. It's very well documented in terms of the banking, financing of Nazi Germany in particular, J.P. Morgan, and what evolved from there in terms of the central banking process. It was pretty much dominant upon U.S. Treasuries and dollars at that point. It's interesting to see that the central banks, the Federal Reserve, the IMF, their ability to really shape and even so much influence, government as well, with the backing of the dollars, and their ability to create money.
Yeah, I mean, and of course, the problem is that okay, there was, in a way, we obviously had. I mean, I more call it a quasi gold standard, and of course, the United States came off that in 1971, and then we had the petrodollar. But as Michael Hudson rightly says, the US came off the gold standard due to the Vietnam War. Obviously it was having enormous budget deficits, and it couldn't. And they said, "Well, we're just hemorrhaging all the gold." Okay, ultimately, the gold's all subsequently all but vanished. But at that point, they came off it, and of course, then the question is, what's going to happen next? And from their perspective, intelligently, they went, "Well, we'll just get nations to buy all the U.S. treasuries. They'll give us all the free dollars, and but no, we're not going to rebuild America. We're just going to create bigger monopolies. We're going to utilize it so we can then just spend militarily to dominate the world, so we can put hundreds of bases all over the world, threaten any nation who isn't part of the old reality." And maybe it's a good point to kind of introduce what I mean by the old reality and what the new reality is. But effectively, sort of post 1971, it was, this started to allow the monopolies to gain more and more control. It ultimately didn't really grab hold until the 1980s. The sort of Thatcher Reagan era was when what we were told was free market economics, which it wasn't. It was exactly the opposite. It was monopolies controlling everything for their own benefit and destroying true economic growth and wealth and prosperity for nations. That's really when it came about. And that was because these kind of, whatever people want to call them, 1%, although they're fractions and fractions of 1% or spheres of influence, as I call them, were started to take a more sort of dominant role, which is hence, we had the military industrial complex and big corporations. You've got obviously the financial sector, you have big pharma, oil industry, etc., all the sort of big corporations. But the military industrial complex is the thing that drives US foreign policy, and US foreign policy is driven to protect the dollar, because everything had to be about protecting the dollar, because once the dollar empire is gone, then this empire, or this old reality, collapses, because it all was dependent on protecting the dollar, making sure the dollar was the world reserve currency. Hence why any nation that defied it, and we've talked in the past about Gaddafi is an obvious one, Saddam Hussein's another one, Assad's another one. The list goes on. Anyone who's defiant, anyone who dares to sort of threaten this, the US dollar, US hegemony complex has to be removed, because it's all about protecting the dollar. But ultimately, of course, the US destroyed its own or cooked its own goose, because nations eventually moved away from the dollar, and we'll come to that at some point in the future. I mean, that really ironically was born out of the Obama era. The Trump era made it even worse, and the Biden era is just joining on that bandwagon. But what do I mean by the old reality? The old reality is kind of post World War II, which effectively was, I've called it in the past, the unholy trinity, which is death, destruction, and grand larceny. Effectively, it was massive banking control, the military, big corporations, but they're now even failing because they've obviously completely abused the system. So it got rid of what the United States had, which was what was called a mixed economy, where you have that marriage between the state and the private sector. And Europe had mixed economies, and of course, ultimately, the 1980s, as we said, saw the destruction of that. That was the end of that. That's when the financial sector took control of everything. They took control out of the hands of government, and it was whether it was Wall Street, the City of London, Germany, France, everywhere else. So the financial sector wanted to take control of everything effectively, to become what some have termed the world's landlords. So feudalism of the, people are talking now about how they're trying to do this. They've been doing it for decades. It's just more. So they're not actually trying to do it anymore. It's just they now know the empire's over, and they're just trying to grab everything they can get their hands on, even though ultimately, of course, it'd be worthless, because they can have $1 trillion. But what's $1 trillion when the dollar's worthless? It's worthless. But so effectively, that's the old empire. The old empire was this fake capitalism, free market capitalism, which was just effectively asset stripping the world, seizing control of everything into the hands of relatively few, with no desire to have any economic growth. I mean, and look at. I mean, the UK is a great example of this. I can remember back in the 90s, kind of asking myself the question: okay, we had all these state industries in the UK. Everything was owned by the state. It was all the steel industry, coal mining, etc., that employed huge amounts of people. And yes, it wasn't economically viable anymore. But my question in my mind, rather naively, was, Well, surely if you're going to get rid of these industries, you need to replace it. You need to have new, well, growth sectors. You need more new investment. You have to rebuild an economy. No, they just basically razed it to the ground, destroyed the economic manufacturing base of the United Kingdom, and replaced it with the financial sector. It was all about just, it wasn't a real economy anymore. They privatized everything. And in the process of privatizing, they created these corporations who effectively then became the landlords, and we became the tenants effectively. And we were paying subsistence to them for their big corporations. And that's really when it all went horribly wrong. And that's why we've really seen stagnant economic, well, or no economic growth, no innovation, no economic development, because everything's privatized. Whereas the new reality, which is what China and Russia did now, obviously Russia had a bit of a problem because in the Yeltsin era, in sort of at the fall of the Soviet Union, Yeltsin just basically, Russia had collapsed, and he just gave the oligarchs who were all Western backed. He basically gave them everything. So he did exactly what the sort of U.S. empire wanted to see, because it was,
he was the perfect puppet. He was the perfect
yeah,
puppet.
he was because the only intelligent thing he did is he put Putin in, and Putin became the scourge of the West, and we'll come to that shortly. I mean, obviously, we kind of missed out the bit where the Soviet Union, as it was, and its empire collapsed. It was completely unsustainable, and the West, of course, wanted to collapse it, or the US wanted it collapsed. Why? Because ultimately they wanted to subjugate everything to be the way they wanted Russia as a satellite of Europe. They hadn't even thought about China, and as far as they were concerned at that point, China was a provincial backwater that was never going to do anything. It was crippled by communism, would stay this communist nation, and most Americans still think it is, which of course China is anything but communist. But anyway, going back to the point, this was kind of Russia had collapsed. This was, then the oligarchs were controlling everything, and what's really angered the United States, and why they have such vilification of Putin, and the satellites, of course, meaning the United Kingdom and Europe, have to all stand there and vilify him, is because he's kicking all the oligarchs out. I mean, look at all the state-owned enterprises. Because Russia and China know when you have control of these entities, you don't have monopolies seizing control of your nation. When you keep these industries in control of the state, they can drive the economy. It becomes real capitalism. So China has not a communist nation, it's a socialist stroke capitalist nation, and it gets the balance right. And it has genuine economic growth, prosperity, driving people out of poverty, hundreds of millions into middle class, can grow its economy at 5, 6, 7% in reality, and not the West goes, they fake all their economic growth. They don't fake their economic growth. They've got an economic model. That's the new reality. The new reality is you will have sovereign nations. You will determine your own destiny. You will not be controlled by the United States. You will not be controlled economically or financially. You will have the ability to create real economic growth. You can have engines of growth, vertical growth sectors. That's the whole point of the Belt and Road, and that's why that's why it drives the Americans insane. Because not the American people, of course, but the sort of power structure, the establishment, and whatever, deep state, whatever you want to call it, because they're looking at it going, hang on, they're replacing our controlling mechanism, and they're going into nation after nation and in continents, and they're signing trade deals, which is a win-win. This nation prospers. Look at Southeast Asia. Look at the real economic growth drivers. That's because they're adopting this Chinese model, which is we can grow our economies, and the economy benefits the people. And we can come on to some other things with regards to sort of economic development, which is, and this is a great example for me in the United States, is we look at the situation and go, everyone in the US believes that they should have to pay for their healthcare. Healthcare is a basic human right. Nobody should be ripped off. No one should be paying extortionate amounts of money for healthcare. That is a basic human right. But a lot of Americans, if you said you have free healthcare, they go, that's socialism. No, it's not socialism. That is how a functioning capitalist society should operate. Why? Because instead of people being subjugated by private corporations who who will charge exorbitant premiums for healthcare, people then have free healthcare or next to nothing they pay for it. They have all that disposable income. That disposable income gets spent into the real economy, which generates real economic growth, which generates prosperity and wealth for the population. But Western countries have been made to believe that's socialism, that's an evil thing. Socialism is communism. Communism, and it's just propaganda. It's the same with the education system. Go to nations where education was free. When I went to university and all the time I spent in education, I didn't pay a penny. All my student fees were free. The state paid my fees. So I could go to university to get educated, to do whatever I did. Now, even the United Kingdom now goes, no, we've effectively privatized education. You are going to pay the universities out your own pocket. £9,500 a year to go to university. And you're going to come out at the end of your degree, if you do 3 years, with 40, £50,000 worth of debt. That's control. We're controlling you. We've got you because you're already massively in debt. The Chinese model is you come out of, at the end of it, you don't have debt. Why? Because we want you to be educated, because you become a productive member of society. You earn money, you get a good job, you're not constrained by paying enormous subsidies of debt to pay your education fees or your healthcare, healthcare insurance. You have more disposable income. You're a more productive member of society. So if you like Western capitalism, keep being screwed by the system. If you like true capitalism, then you wanted the new reality. The new reality is that's not going to exist in the future. Now, obviously, for Western nations, this is an enormous problem because what's left of the controlling influence of the West is going, well, we don't want to give up our control. Okay, we know we've now lost control. We know, and that's why I said the pandemic was their worst nightmare. Pandemic was the death sentence for what was left of their empire that was staggering along, trying to keep
Hey,
control
Paul.
by. Sorry, go on.
No, I don't want to get too far ahead in regards to the discussion, and I think
Yes,
that
go on.
you made some very valid points in regards to the systematic difference, and I think it's very important for people and our listeners to understand that that the debt-based model that was established here in the United States was primarily for the banks. It was driven off a debt base to to establishment of interest rates where there was a constant variable of paying into the banks. So the government, in part, felt more aligned with the banks than they did the people, and that's a fundamental difference in terms of what I deem and I call fake capitalism. What's perceived here in the United States was that, and you're absolutely right, from the moment that a young person graduates from high school, where then they're forced to go into $100,000 of debt and to a constant variable that's there to pay the interest back to the banks, to their automobile that they purchase, or their living situation. All this is designed as a way of constantly keeping the banks propped up and keeping that going, and that system is no longer going to be sustainable, Paul.
No, that's exactly it. It's again, you owe debt. You're effectively the tenant. They're the landlord dishing out the debt and raking in money. But yes, of course, ultimately, it's completely unsustainable. We can talk at some point about how from the 80s the way the financialization of the economy and why it was an utter disaster. Why? I mean, it was so ludicrous what they did, because ultimately greed was going to destroy everything, and that's precisely what happened in 2008. But I mean, effectively, Western economies became controlled by financial institutions and spheres of influence. Governments were effectively hijacked then. And what happens in China is you get bank credit to finance economic development. So infrastructure, you've got manufacturing, innovation, all, machinery for plants, you've got agriculture, energy, technology, you've got all the infrastructure, ports, roads, railways, all owned, note, by the state. In Western nations, all the utilities are privately owned. That effectively, that's again this kind of landlord rent relationship. So effectively, finance in the West is not from banks. No, they don't. They don't. They just want to lend money to put you in debt, and they don't finance growth and production, and productive economic growth. China does. That's the big difference. China does that. So effectively, democratic governments were lost. The European Union's a great example. Gradually lets erode nations' ability to make sovereign decisions. You don't have increasingly less sovereign nations. And the United States goal for Europe was rather like the United States of America. They want the United States of Europe, which means you have no sovereignty. You lose all control. You don't, not only do you lose monetary control, you have loss of economic control. And effectively, the financial sector, for want of a better description, is just asset strips, everything it can get its hands on. That's hence why we've seen all the stories with regards to how I said the IMF and the World Bank would operate. And we talked about Russia, and of course, when Yeltsin lost control or just gave it all to the oligarchs, and Putin came in and went, "That's not happening anymore." China would never let that happen. And this is where I say to you, the people I know who are the architects of the new reality, the multipolar world, stepped in and said to Russia and China, look, this is what they're trying to do. You need to avoid this. You need to make sure you don't put yourself in these positions. So what did Putin do? He stopped and gradually rolled back all the oligarchs. He put industry into the public sector. So all the big corporations are owned by the state. And of course, China looked at this and went, well, we're never going to allow that. That's why, note, when the private sector started to become too big in the tech companies recently, China stepped in and went, hang on, you're not doing this. We're not allowing you to have that level of control. And everyone in the West is going, look, China's trying to control free capitalism. No, China's trying to make sure that this pseudo-free capitalism isn't hijacked by the West and used to try and dictate policy to the Chinese government, which would then, for me, they would lose control. Therefore, you start to have fake capitalism and trying to subjugate the Chinese government structure. Because the United States would love to have a Yeltsin type Chinese president, someone who's completely subjugated by the West, who will completely hand over all state control to private corporations, monopolies, and destroy China's economic growth and prosperity. But that's why, as you said, they hate Putin, because he's done that. And the reality is there are different stages of nations joining the new reality and the old reality. So there are the West, the United States, the UK, Europe are effectively in the old reality still. Yeah, they try to occasionally, break out of this. We've seen how Greece wants to, is had trade relations with the Chinese. Hungary is another example with Russia, and they're absolutely vilified for doing it, and they do everything to try and remove the political leadership. And it's the United States driving this. It's not Brussels, it's the United States, because they're looking at this going, this nation might achieve autonomy. They might leave the European Union. If they leave the European Union, we're in big, big trouble. Because, okay, Britain leaving is one thing, but Britain, of course, never joined the European Union as in terms of having the euro currency because they fudged the criteria to make it look like they couldn't meet the criteria to join. Why? Because they knew full well in that regard what was going on. It was a bridge too far for them. But digressing, if we look at what you would define as real sovereign nations that have control and autonomy over their decision making, who are the three obvious examples? China, Russia, Iran. Okay, you can argue North Korea as well, but we're talking about North Korea is kind of, with all due respect to it, is kind of not economically a potential powerhouse of the future. Iran is, but why do we think the United States guns all the time for China, Russia, and Iran? Because they're sovereign nations, because they have control over their industry, they have control over their government, has control over the economy, they can make the appropriate decisions and to better a nation. Okay, Iran's been hamstrung by sanctions and US aggression for 40 years. Why? Because it wants to subjugate and crush Iran out of existence. And we know for the obvious reasons, because sovereign nations who have control are therefore able to make the right decisions, and the United States doesn't want that. And that effectively at the moment is the backbone of the Eurasian axis. You have to at some point factor in Europe, at some point Germany will join the Eurasian axis. But obviously Germany is people always go, Germany controls the European Union. Germany is completely subjugated by the European Union. And the reason being is the fact that if the European Union goes down, Germany's on the hook for all the French debt. The French is on the hook for most of the Italian debt. So if Italy goes down, France goes down, Germany goes down. It's a controlling mechanism. Why? Because and we've said, how many times have I said this? The United States is terrified of German Russian rapprochement. It's terrified of Germany breaking away and joining the Eurasian axis because their control mechanism has gone. It would disintegrate, dissolve, disappear overnight. And therefore, what's left now of their empire, okay, they had big aspirations post-World War II. Well, they didn't materialize, and now it's an empire seriously in contraction. And it's made all the wrong decisions, economically, geopolitically, financially for decades, which is why I've said the United States has been in terminal decline, ironically. Since the end of World War II, when it thought it had aspirations to become this global power that would control the world and ultimately form this kind of one world governance structure. It was always down to the United States. No one else wanted it. At the back end of World War II, the British and the Russians refused to ever acquiesce or agree to that ever becoming a reality. So in essence, it was worth mentioning at this point these two kind of competing spheres or spheres of reality almost. One is the future that the world wants to embrace. It's why the old reality, the Western Empire is collapsing, the ascendant empire is the East, and the West has no growth sectors. Effectively, the whole economy is credit, debt driven. People borrow money, they pay it to banks and monopolies, and that's the economy. So there's no growth anywhere in Western economies. You have effectively a service sector which just recycles pounds, dollars, euros, and no one actually makes any money except the monopolies at the top and the banks. Although, of course, now even they're starting to collapse because their economic model is completely unsustainable. You cannot have a system that abuses the economy and the financial system for the personal gain of a few and think that that's sustainable, because ultimately the kind of landlord tenant relationship means that they have to have millions of tenants paying the landlord. When millions of tenants or hundreds of millions can't pay the landlord anymore, the landlord goes bust themselves. So yes, they have reached a point where it's a point of no return. It's not a point of control anymore. It's a point of utter collapse. So yes, the sort of spheres of influence know the game's up. They know it's over, but what they'll do in the process is they don't care about what happens to Europe. Neither do the people who are in Europe who control everything for the benefit of the United States. They think they're going to come out of it okay, and who cares whether the Europe collapses, the United States collapses. But it's not, they're collapsing it to take control of it again. The gravy train's over. They've cooked their goose. There's no way they can ever retain control of it. So now, as it's collapsing, they're going, okay, well, it's kind of scorched earth economic policy. And the pandemic was really their worst nightmare. So they're now going, well, we're running out of road, we're running out of time. Okay, let's see if we can extract, not wealth, but extract money out of what's there. We'll try and squeeze the system a little bit more. But as we now know, effectively, there is no economic growth for them. They've wrecked everything. So it's the kind of what they feel is their last payday before the old reality collapses. The problem with the old reality collapsing in the West is, how long does it take for the old reality to collapse? What's the ramifications for people in the West? In the process, how long does it take for the West to get out of the old reality and into the new reality?
Yeah.
And I think that's probably a good point to start.
Yeah, that's a great
part one.
great introduction to part one in terms of the emergence of the reform, if you will, of the the world economic multipolar evolving that's currently. And I think it's important for everyone to understand in history proportions as to what happened, why it happened. And part two, Paul, perhaps can be strategically looking at geopolitical things that are happening, whether we look at Syria, Ukraine, Iran. There's numerous things that we can discuss in terms of the relevance and importance of it. Go ahead.
Yeah, part two will be, okay, look, we've jumped a little bit forward to why it's collapsing now, but we need to go back to the late 90s, early 2000s. What drove the birth of the multipolar world? What was China, Russia being advised? What were they seeing? What were they being steered to understand? The people driving the multipolar world, or the birth of it, which the Chinese, the Russians, and were just absolute visionaries. They knew what was going on in the West. They knew what was coming. They knew the threats, the dangers. They foresaw 2008 years before practically anybody else. They basically said, okay, if you get stuck in this system, you're going to go down with it. It's the end of the West. There's going to be a vacuum. Someone has to fill the vacuum. China. It wasn't like China was suddenly made the right economic choice. They were making the right decisions, but then they started to grow and expand and do things differently. And we can talk about that. Talk about the birth of the multipolar world, when it started to come to fruition, how it was born, how the West was then trying to fight back against this. And you make points on what Ukraine was about, what Syria was about, what happened in Iraq, what happened in Afghanistan, and so we're sort of going post 2000, and probably we can discuss all that, and then where we are currently, what's going on in a very broad sense, and probably do it. So we can probably do this in two parts. I mean, obviously, we're not going to discuss everything, because if I wanted to discuss everything, I'd literally have to go back and tell everyone what I've done in nearly 1,150 podcasts myself, which would take about 500 or 600 hours. So we're not going to do that.
Right, correct.
Because that's just too much detail. But this is to give a kind of 30,000 foot view of. So it's a good point to stop there, and then we'll do part two and bring that out, ASAP.
Absolutely. Paul, thank you for a great discussion today. And for those tuning in, again, please go to the gadfly.vhx.tv. Also like, share this video. And don't forget to go over and visit Paul and support his work over at theseriesreport.com. Paul, thank you so much. And I'm confident we'll be doing this again soon.
Yeah, pleasure.